sponsors for their continued support. We've got
meeting is being recorded.
I just want to thank our sponsors for their continued support, and particularly difficult year last year, but great year and great runway ahead of us this year with events. We're somewhat hybrid over the next month. It looks like we're very peaky in COVID over the next week, in fact, as it's playing out. So we do hope to get back face to face in a few short months. Thanks, Ashley. So look, upcoming events, we've got a bit of a runway through March and April, and we've got further events in this COVID series after this, which we're shaping up. On the 16th of March, we have our Young Leaders event hosted by Bailey's. We've got Paula Bennett, who of course you'll all know. She's part of a crew with Michael Holloway, and Ashley Duke will be leading that event around creating a mentoring culture in a hybrid world. So really looking forward to that event hosted by Bailey's. And then we've got predictions and resolutions following, and a State of the Nation address in Wellington, which will be very interesting in April, which I'm really looking forward to. Thanks, Ashley. And of course, our symposium. So we've got a really interesting symposium event shaping up, which will be face to face, but also available by hybrid. So we're really getting our hybrid meetings really in a slick way now. And but there'll be opportunities there for face to face later in May. And in June. So just hold fire for that one. The key topics there around pushing the limits will be, we've got a great speakers lined up, which we'll start to announce on sustainability, productivity and culture. Of course, productivity really important in these remote working times, technology, and the challenge of growth and contraction. Some really interesting topic to explore there. So that's really what's coming up over the next time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ashley, who will introduce our speaker today. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Rod. And thank you everyone for joining this morning. It's great for you all to be here and to listen to our guest speaker today. So just a quick, obviously, introduction of the event today. So obviously with us recently moving into, I guess, phase 2 of the Omicron plan, we're beginning to see a bit of beginning to experience the various challenges that the pandemic is throwing us. Whilst our immediate focus, obviously, particularly with the New Zealand real estate, is how we continue to operate as much as normal over the next few months while we deal with this pandemic or the Omicron outbreak. We're very interested in, obviously, what the longer term picture will look like. So as part of this series of conversations with the CoreNet Global Network, we're holding this first event with Steve Wright, who I guess is looking at the response of our UK colleagues overseas have just been through it. So thank you for joining us again. Steve, by way of introduction, is the Chair of Communities for the UK chapter of CoreNet Global. He has led the COVID hackathon over there, or the response in April or May of 2020, actually, to produce an overview of what lay ahead. And so this was a worldwide sharing webinar with Australia, Singapore, and India. So I'm quite keen to hear a little bit about that shortly, Steve, and the detail around that. But also, just as a background of Steve, he's a lead consultant at HCG Workplace Strategists. And former head of workplace design. So Steve's perspective covers a wide range of property planning topics, as well as the creation of high performance working environments. He's fascinated by the differences in working culture and practices across the globe, and how these regional variances are delivered accordingly to property. So thank you so much for joining us today, Steve. And it's great to have you on here today and to really start to hear about some of, obviously, the UK's responses to COVID, obviously the Omicron outbreak, and kind of have the perspective of where you all are as we're kind of currently going through it. So welcome, Steve. Some of the things I know that he will cover off today that we'll be going through is what we thought would happen on the outset of COVID-19, what we saw happen. And this is over in the UK, obviously, what they learned from the experiences, but what we're doing now for what's the plan for the future now that they've been through it, and how can we move forward. So over to you, Steve. Thank you very much for joining. And if there is any questions along the way, maybe just jot them down and we can go through them and try and respond to them towards the end of Steve's conversation.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Firstly, thanks everyone for dialing in this morning, the evening my time. I hope I'm going to shed a little bit of light on your day, and I'll leave you in time ready to go and grab a cup of coffee and ready for your 9 o'clock meeting if we can get through the questions. But please do make a note of any questions you have as we run through this morning. It'll be a pleasure to discuss what's been happening here, and maybe our perspectives, maybe some of my perspectives, not necessarily the UK government's perspectives, but we'll get through it one way or another. So I am going to take you through what we thought would happen, what actually happened, some anecdotes about what happened as well. It's not all doom and gloom. There was a bit of humour running through the whole thing. What we've learned as a consequence of it, and probably most importantly, is what we're doing now. How are we getting people back to work? How are we actually looking at the issues facing our real estate industry and certainly the world of fit out and workplace creation? But I'd like to wind back the clock as a starting point, and I'd like to take you back to the 23rd of January 2020. And I must say there was 4 pages of UK government information on this when I started to read through the timeline yesterday. I am not going to give it all to you because you will be asleep by the end of it if I do. What I want to do is just pick out some of the key issues and key things that happened to us here in the UK, give you a bit of an illustration of how the COVID pandemic really affected the general populace. And then we'll start to talk about that in the context of work, because I think it's quite important. I know that New Zealand has had a different journey to the UK in terms of your response, and that was close the borders, which I think was probably quite a sensible thing to do. Not quite so easy when you're in London and you've got 15 million people there and 3 major airports and all the other bits and pieces that go with it. But this is how it started. So I'll tell you a little story and what we went through, and then we'll look at some of the consequences and how that's influenced what we're doing now. So the 23rd of January 2020 was our first bit of real advice. We'd heard the news alerts coming out. We'd heard about Wuhan. We'd heard about super spreaders and some of the people who were traveling back from a conference in China and giving the rest of Europe a dose of COVID. On the 23rd, we had an announcement from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which was to advise the UK population against travel to Wuhan. Excuse me if I'm looking, so do see me looking down, but there's an awful lot of data that I'm going to refer to as we go through this. And soon after that, British Airways suspended the flights. Well, I think we had on the 23rd of January about 6 cases in the UK, and by the 30th of January, those had been confirmed, and we then got into the kind of rapid spread scenario. Around about that time, there wasn't too much of a shutdown generally going on for us. People were expected to be a bit cautious. Supermarkets were starting to run out of toilet roll, which was an interesting phenomenon. I don't know how long people thought they were going to be at home for, but toilet roll, that was first. And we were advised against panic buying of toilet roll. Soon after that went a lot of dried goods, which were rice, pasta, etc., and then tinned goods. So the first few days, or first sort of easing into that period, wasn't particularly pleasant. There was a bit of an alarmist response, if you like, and all the things that the government asked you not to do, everyone went and did. Just like there's no petrol, we've got a shortage, so everyone goes out and queues up at the petrol station to get what's left. But anyway, that's human behaviour. By the 23rd of March in 2020, we had the lockdown brought in. And we were advised to undertake essential travel only. The furlough scheme kicked into operation, where people were then locked out of their offices, and the government paid basically the wages of most of the UK, I would think, from the people who were suspended. Key workers were made a priority and given all sorts of access to various things, including supermarket queues, which is quite often, honestly, the right thing to do. Let's keep the health service and the other bits and pieces that we need moving. The furlough scheme we thought was going to be really quite short term, but it ran on for the best part of a year. And so that was just the start of it. The survey data that was collected by the UK government at the end of March actually gave two alarming statistics, actually, and this is going to be a little bit of a recurring theme about mental health. Anxiety levels were up again amongst the general population from 17% to 38%. So quite a lot of worry, as you could see, coming into the equation, and a similar coefficient for depression. And the figures for depression ran from 16% to 38% again. So you were starting to see this kind of reflection in the general population of, this is something that is way bigger than the cold we all thought it was going to be. Let's get over it and get back to work. We realized that things were starting to change, and we didn't really know where the end of it was going to come. However, by the 1st of June, we had the first restrictions lifted on us, and by mid-June, we had a traffic light system of five different gradings of response that we had, from red being the most severe down to green. By mid-June, we had been downgraded on the threat level from level 4 to level 3, which meant that we could actually get out and do certain things. And the country started to operate again to a reasonable level. However, what we did start to see along that were specific city lockdowns coming into effect, most notably in the Midlands, and by July we'd actually had, by June we had Leicester lockdown and part of Birmingham, and by July Manchester, one of the major cities of the UK. So this thing was then starting to be managed on a regional basis. By the 26th of August, I promise you this does get a bit quicker. The BBC has started to report that the UK's largest employers were not planning on bringing people back for an immediate start in the workplace, but people were starting to consider how this might work for them, how this might affect the general workplace sector, and particularly those people who are in office jobs. And at that time, to mirror that, we got quite an interesting announcement came out from one of the UK's major banks, and that was a shoot from the hip statement made by a CEO, which was, we no longer need the ivory towers, everyone can work from home. I'm going to come back to that, but please remember that one, because it's quite an important, well, I think quite a brave statement that was made, and somebody who obviously did favour the deconstruction of the office structures that we have in place at the moment. By September, we'd had the students accepting their places, starting to go to university, and of course, with students going back to uni, Freshers Week, all the other good stuff, another outbreak. So September to October last year was really the sort of the younger people's turn to catch everything, where it seemed like everyone who's in the older age groups had been catching it beforehand, but the spread amongst the student population was really quite speedy. And we ended up with in a kind of volatile situation coming into the autumn, which was local and regional ratings. And I'm sure you guys have all heard of the R rate. The R rate for us was starting to creep up into the 1.1, 1.4 again, which is big spread territory. I know that's been surpassed in a lot of places, and I think maybe even in New Zealand. But the R rate was the indicator that people were then starting to use for the precautions we needed to do. And the R rate rising gave rise to itself National Lockdown 2, the sequel. So we went into a 4-week fire break, as they called it, which was to try and actually put the brakes on COVID in the run up to Christmas. And we were promised 4 weeks and it'll be over. We need to do this now. We need to hit it hard. We need to hit it fast. And that was all great. And so we came out of that lockdown at the beginning of December, ready to go and do our Christmas shopping. Started to do a bit of that and plan and see the relatives we hadn't seen for a year. And on the 19th of December, Christmas was cancelled. So we then had this, we know you all wanted to go and see grandma, but you can't. You better put the turkey back in the freezer. And things were starting to break down again in what actually happened. But I think that the population in the UK was at that point where we'd seen so many things happen. We knew it was for the best, trusting in what the government's advice was going to be, and certainly with our chief medical officer here. And I have to say, it's been very reassuring, the advice and the level of transparency in the news that we've heard from the government about these things. So that kind of took us to the end of 2020. 2021 saw the start of the vaccine rollout for us. And we're one amongst, I'm sure you read about it as well, but we were amongst one of the first countries to actually come out with a universal vaccine, which was deployed as quickly as possible, using troops, using various medical centres, using all sorts of devices open to people, and the take-up rate on it was very good. We've now got through the vaccine rollout, vaccine 2, and our boosters, and an awful lot of people and younger people have had that. We've also had variants, and variants I know is something that is big on your agenda at the moment, as you have Omicron. Well, in the UK, we had the original virus, which was particularly nasty in the amount of lives that it took and the amount of illness that it actually caused, closely followed by the South African variant, which was also quite a rapid spreader. We had the Eta variant, which was of, again, African origin and particularly attributed to Nigeria. We had the Indian variant, and then somebody decided we should no longer call these things by the countries they were being traced from, and we should give them all an alphabetic listing. So Indian variant became the Delta variant. And we had the Brazilian variant, which everyone was warned about. That didn't really take off, came to nothing. And we ended up most recently with the Omicron variant, which I know is the same one that you guys have been going through recently.
Yeah.
I would just add at this point that whilst it was a super quick spread on that and the take up of it, most people recorded mild cold symptoms. And I hope that that's the same of what you're going through over there, and you haven't had a mutation of that variant to make it anything worse. Anyway, so where are we now? We ended up in autumn, hoping that Christmas wouldn't be cancelled again. And I think that the government, being quite sensitive to what we'd been through, took quite a sensible decision on that one, which was use caution. You know enough about it now. Don't put yourselves in a position of risk, and manage that and help us to manage that as well. Let's not overwhelm the National Health Service. And the upswell of public opinion and people getting behind those kind of initiatives has been high. There's been a great deal of respect for everyone working in that. A lack of selfishness is probably the best way to put it. Anyway, quite a long-winded introduction into the conclusions that we can take from that timeline. And where did it take us to? Well, really, for the general population, a period of uncertainty, and that's on the individual level and on the business level, a level of frustration, I think, for an awful lot of people. We had certain other things happen. Last summer, you could go on holiday, and then while you're on holiday, all your return flights were cancelled and you have to go into isolation when you get back. So there was a lot of these conflicting things, and where information was still causing a lot of disruption to people's lives. And we've ended up with some volatility, and I'm sure the position is the same for you. It's volatility around commerce, it's volatility around the way that business is conducted, and also operating structures. We've seen an awful lot of things shift in the UK, particularly with home shopping, logistics. There's been a rise in that sector dramatically, while certain other things have not been going on. And obviously a delivery driver can't drive his van from his living room. So you end up with certain people having to get back out there, go and do it. All of these things have taken a bit of a toll on the population, and battered and bruised quite a few employers, I think, as we've handled the work from home or back to work debate. What do we do? You heard the comment that I mentioned before, and just please do bear in mind that at least one of the banks actually said that there was no more ivory towers, whilst Goldman Sachs, and I will name Goldman Sachs because they actually did put it in the press in New York, saying we want all our people back because critical mass is everything to the way in which we operate. So we had some conflicting messages coming out there as well from employers. So what were we doing about it in CoreNet? Well, Ash, you just mentioned the COVID hackathon, the COVID-19 hackathon, which was a global event and a virtual ideation experience, as it was called. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it was a global event, and we responded. A whole number of countries came together. We developed our individual plans, our visions, our thoughts on how this may affect us, society, work, etc. And we combined all of those into our hackathon output, which was an advisory set of notes and details, which were then presented via global seminars and bringing those back to our membership. And they really started to outline my first starting point, which is what we thought would happen. And I'm just going to refer to a few things on this screen as I go through. But what we did was we took this apart in the UK from a workplace wellbeing perspective. And of course, workplace wellbeing impacts on so many other areas that it became a global kind of, this is what's going to happen in the world of work thing anyway. So the wellbeing still did form a part of it, but didn't become the be all and end all of it. And we started from the position of the here and now, which we were in a wave. We didn't know when it would end, and we didn't know if the second wave was coming. We started to predict the phased return to work, transition strategies, what people could do in offices, what they needed to do, how they needed to win the hearts and minds, and reaffirm to people that it was safe to come back to work. I think is probably one of the most driving factors that we were dealing with at that particular time. And a whole bunch of transition measures were driven out by that. So that was things that I'm sure you've seen, which is safe distancing between seats, making sure that one-way systems were in place, making sure that lifts weren't overcrowded, that staircases, you may even have an go up in the lift, come down the staircase rule, one-way system, and various things that were brought in to make the workplace safer for the employee. So from an employer's perspective, there was this very hurried running around and testing of business as usual plans, contingency plans in a way that they'd never been tested before. And indeed against some measures that I don't think had even been foreseen before. Whoever thought that this whole thing was going to be a global pandemic that was going to come and bite the whole of the world, and we'd have to respond in these ways. You know, if we were sort of looking at this as a business as usual thing, we might have thought we have a power cut to London or the data center goes down. That was the level of planning that was in place. And obviously bigger organizations had a bigger and wider plan, but an awful lot of smaller employers were really caught unaware in this and didn't know where to go. So from a staff perspective, we had a lot of people going through fear factors about stability of employment as well, which rocked a whole load of people. Will I still have a job when this is over? About their physical health, their mental health, their personal safety, how they were going to travel, what they were going to do. And the landlords, of course, started to become very swept up in buildings where they now had tenants who were under occupying space. In fact, some people mothballing space, taking it right down to a zero occupancy level and turning the lights off. So you had a mixture of responses from landlords and what they needed to do at that particular time. Smart buildings fared quite well because you had the ability in their systems for sensors to say, hey, you know, there's only 6 people on the 6th floor today. We only need half the bank of lights on. And by the way, we don't need all that fresh air. So we had energy consumption figures being controlled by those smart systems, being manually controlled elsewhere. And I think the risk kind of started to crop up for empty buildings where they weren't being heated or lit or patrolled on a sort of regular basis. And you start to get environmental atmospheric factors affecting the interiors. Then you've got dormant water sitting in pipework that needs cleaning with chlorine and all the other things that you needed to do to recommission. So sometimes it was actually easier to keep the building shut than it was to try and force them into a half service kind of duty that they were providing for their occupants. So landlords again started to be hit by these things. From the individual perspective, I've mentioned that slightly. We started to look at reshaping operations and long-term measures that would start to come in and become prevalent. And we came up with some forecasts. I'm going to read you a couple of forecasts because I think we got some things right in this. Forecast 1, existing workplace design norms will change and many space efficiency measures will enter a regression phase. What do we mean by that? Well, basically, you're not going to be able to get as many people into your workspaces, and you're probably going to need to redesignate some of the areas that you had as max pack desking into more breakout and incidental use spaces. So we were quite right on that one. Staff will start to seek alternative workplaces and work styles, and they'd value smaller groups, less commuting, flexible working, and access to fresh air and reduction of enclosed spaces. Well, again, we saw a huge upswell in that. What we did see was an awful lot of things happening online where LinkedIn was certainly full of the debate about, in the future, I intend to work 3 days a week in the office. I intend to work full time from home. I. And actually, it was all about the individual. What we didn't see at that point was the kind of response from employers saying, actually, we're thinking about this at the moment, we don't quite have the answer, but it was quite a presumptive thing. And that, again, was quite important to us, because as a culture, I think what it's given us is a bit of a split between the people who actually do want to return to work and to a workplace with real people and a real environment, to those who are actually quite happy doing it from home. And that disconnect can start to affect things in a lot of negative ways. So we thought that would happen. It has happened. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. We looked also at the future considerations, and one of the other things we actually suggested that employers and organizations did was consider whether an approach for split working would actually reduce the need for space in future, based on 50% of people being present. So this presenteeism, absenteeism argument started to crop up into it. Again, that starts to push back against landlords. So what do you do if you've only your lease break is 5 years down the road, but you can already foresee that you only need 2/3 of the space that you signed up for, and you're going to end up in this situation where you're paying for all of it, using some of it. It starts to distort the economics and the balance books of any company. So again, I think that one was quite an interesting one for us. The implications going forward were, there's a whole bunch of things that I think that people are doing now, maybe that they weren't doing before, which was reviewing business continuity plans and really testing them against the things that you never thought you'd have to do. We have started to see other things we also predicted, which were new roles, wellbeing champions and mental health champions, mental health first aiders being appointed inside organizations, and HR recognizing that their own response needed to be slightly different in the way that people handled things, and they treated people who are on the return from work. So those are kind of an outline of the things we thought might happen, thought would happen. Quite a few of them were true. They have come true. The way in which people have responded, maybe not so. But I'd now like to just talk to you a little bit about what happened as a result of some of those things. Some of this is a bit amusing, some of it's a bit shocking, but this is all true. So we spoke about the need for social distancing at work, safe working, one-way systems, etc. And employees were quite reassured to see that employers were actually going about this, and FM teams were starting to make some changes to the premises for safe occupation. We ended up in a situation where employers based on the London region made a statement saying that we could now achieve approximately 60% of safe occupancy in the buildings, because we've put in plastic sneeze screens, one-way stickers on the floor, and we've taken out every other desk so people can't sit within 2 meters of each other. So 60% of our workforce can come back. However, nobody thought to check with London Transport. And the measures that were brought in by the Mayor of London prioritised key workers and making sure that travel on the network was safe, also reflecting that a number of train drivers, bus drivers, etc., had been affected by the illness and were therefore out and in isolation, unable to work. So while 60% of people could get into the office, only 15% of them could travel. So that was quite an alarming statistic in London. What that actually meant was, if you don't need to be a genius to work it out, an awful lot of people went out, spent money on measures they thought would help, but became obsolete because they physically couldn't get their people back there in the first place. So pitfall number one. One of the other things we saw was, as I mentioned previously on LinkedIn, we saw these kind of wild predictions of what people thought they'd like to do themselves and taking the power back. We ended up also with all of the office doomsters and the naysayers out there, and I know we know quite a few of them, had their 5 minutes of fame saying the office is dead, we can all work from home, we no longer need a centralised workplace. Well, yeah, all well and good. Okay, did it come true? No. Employees, meanwhile, while all this has been going on, have found a voice for their preferences. There is an overwhelming sense in the UK that people do want to adopt hybrid working. But I think that most people recognise that hybrid working now is something that needs to be done in collaboration with the views and requirements of your organisation and your employer. there are a number of pitfalls that come out of that. I will talk about those now, actually, rather than leading to the next section. But there's been a general awareness that where remote working becomes the norm, there's a whole load of things that don't go so well for organisations, which is a lack of team spirit starts to creep in. We start to see a lack of mentoring, and we're now about to go into the second generation of graduates coming into the workplace, a number of whom would not have had the office as their first place of employment. And that's a kind of career distortion at the front end. And I think that we'd all recognise that there's an awful lot of younger people in our organisations who might be happy to walk past my desk, your desk, ask us a question, which may seem a bit of a stupid question, but as they're in passing and it's about team spirit, they feel quite happy to ask you. But they're not going to pick up the phone or book a Teams call to ask you something which they may consider to be dumb. So mentoring has been affected by this, and people witnessing what their peers do. If you can't physically see what the lawyer partner that you're working under, how he conducts his phone calls and how he does stuff on a daily basis, you can't learn by osmosis remotely. So there's a downside to all of this stuff. Career guidance, performance has started to suffer. Efficiency and output has started to suffer as a result of the decentralization of workplaces. I just want to come back also to the rash statement that I referred to of one of our leading banks, if we no longer need ivory towers. And this was another thing that happened. So the big statement was made. A few people started to question whether the 7,500 people that work in London for the organisation could realistically work from home. The whole dialogue from that particular bank then went very quiet. Radio silence crept in. What we suspect was happening was actually somebody from real estate and somebody from HR gave the CEO a bit of a tap on the shoulder and said, hold on a minute, we actually need to think here, because we've now got, if people are working from home, 7,500 ergonomic assessments to do. We need to provide 7,500 desks. We need to make sure that 7,500 broadband systems are working effectively and the connectivity is there. So the hidden cost of decentralization started to creep in. And also that, alongside the sort of forward vision of people starting to lose that team spirit and the team performance angles, influenced that. That particular bank came back online about 6 months later and did a U-turn in terms of that statement. We do need workplace. We're just going to configure it differently. We're going to provide differently for our people. So lesson learned and a bit of humility. I'm not going to name who they were, but it might begin with B. Anyway, the next thing I think was another surprise factor was in terms of green credentials and sustainability. And whilst you can turn off the lights, you can turn off the ventilation systems on your buildings, you can start to show the figures that you're actually, the energy usage that you've got going down, and therefore claim that your green credentials have probably improved dramatically during lockdown and everything else. However, again, a bit like the rash statement of we can all work from home, the work from home part of it didn't really account for the 2,500 people these organizations have then working remotely with their central heating running at home, their electric bills going up, them having to pay, actually employers paying employees for the use of their home facilities and all the other things. So whilst you had a decentralized workforce, certain employers weren't reporting on the fact that, yes, the green credentials have improved dramatically. We no longer have this level of consumption. However, as an organization, we still do. It's a bit like an iceberg. You can see this bit because it's our ivory tower. It's our flagship office. But what you can't see is all those 2,000 people that are sitting at home in a bedroom trying to do the same work and using energy in a different way. And mothballing space, again, some levels of success. I had particularly had one of my own buildings which was just completed and at the time of lockdown then went into an empty status, waiting for a tenant to take up the lease. In the 12 months until that lease went, the environmental factors of humidity took its toll on that, and we're actually having to replace the ceiling now because it was a smaller building and wasn't maintained in a way that a smart building would be maintained. So moving on, and I'm conscious of time, moving on to what we learned. What lessons came out of this for us? Well, firstly, and I think this is probably one of the most important things, we had always found HR in the UK quite difficult to get to the table to take part in corporate restructuring discussions. Certain organisations much more mature than others, but certain organisations saw HR as a hire, fire, tell people what their bonuses are and put them on the next training course function. What we have found is that HR has needed to become the voice of the brand, talking the values of the organisations to the people in the battle for hearts and minds to get them, keep them firstly on board and secondly get them back into the workplace. So the new Holy Trinity has emerged in the boardroom, and it's comprised of real estate, HR and IT. IT being the glue which has kept everything together over the whole period of lockdown. Without IT, we just wouldn't have done it. The IT scenario for us in terms of the IT scape, if there is such a thing, or I could call it that, we've actually seen the use of IT and its maturity progress 10 years in an 18-month period. And that has been the take up of all of the remote meeting platforms, new programs, login systems, far greater use of things like Microsoft 365, where you can take your information with you on the move. And again, without IT really stepping up to the plate on this, and also dealing with fixing people's little niggles on why their laptop's not working on a Tuesday morning, has given us quite an interesting level of progress. So by consequence, one of the other things we have seen, data centers, that market has taken off in terms of mission critical. This call's happening through a data center. The last transaction I did this morning to pay for my groceries happened through a data center. All of this stuff is, we've started to see the shift. Like I mentioned, logistics, distribution, and data. Those three things have really kind of moved forward. The other consequences I think that we've probably learned quite a lot on are is we've had the split and staff views of the I'm going to take back the power, I'd like to do this, or I'm listening to the corporate message. And we've seen a real split between the people who are desperate to get back into the workplace and the people who are desperate to stay at home. And in the middle is probably most of the normal people amongst us. And I count myself in that one. A few good days in the office balanced by a few days doing what I can do elsewhere is absolutely fine for me. We've seen space demand, however, become fluid because of this. The whole way in which people have responded and which organizations have responded, space demand has become very fluid, and it's really started to put the pressure onto strategic portfolio planning, which takes me quite neatly with a couple of minutes to go into what we're doing about it in the UK now. And please do get your questions lined up. We'll try and deal with as many as we can as we go through as well in the next part. But what we're doing about it, I'm going to be honest, we're still taking stock. We're still identifying our new priorities, and those priorities do vary based on the size of the organization and the sectors that they're in. Some have been hit worse than others, whilst pharmaceutical sector is actually flying and shares are massively going up as we speak. Coming back onto the strategic portfolio planning exercise, how do real estate executives plan for fluidity if you don't know what that fluidity looks like? You can have a great plan for bringing in smart buildings, buying into all of those objectives and the energy consumption and the way in which buildings are managed. But if you're not in one of those buildings, you need to have a plan. This has meant speaking in much more detail with landlords, and I've also been mediating a three-way debate, a three-session debate actually, which is on the whole landlord-occupier discussion. What do occupiers think they're going to need coming out of this? What are landlords providing? What does that new centre ground look like? How do people actually inform that debate, and how do we make that happen? We factored in the voices of HR and IT into those new premises and into those new lease and deal arrangements. It's pushing towards things like shorter lease break terms, maybe taking some common space, which is shared with other building. If you're in a split building, you've got 2 floors, somebody else has got 2 floors, but the floor that's between you, is that something the landlord might take on and turn that into communal space, which you could flex into and out of as the need of your organization demands. What that's all pointing to, and I will come to my summary point, which is we're now in a position of having far greater reliance on strategy, which is quite good news for me. This is not an advert for what I do, but it is good news for me, because we've seen over the last 18 months a whole bunch of organizations needing to get this strategy determined so that they can start to deal with their workforce, deal with the whole confidence levels of getting their business back up and running, whilst looking at how they might go forward with this. What's the plan going to be? Is it going to be 50-50? Is it going to be remote working in 5 years' time? What are our growth plans looking like now, and how does that determine what it is we're going to do? At that point, I'm going to leave it. I hope I've given you a real whistle-stop tour through a whole bunch. It's such a wide topic, but Ashley, I'll pass back to you, and let's go to questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. I think we can, appreciate everything that you've said. I think some we can really relate to, and others, I think we're coming towards some of the heated parts of, I guess, the outbreak. So it's really interesting to hear, what's been happening over there. And there are a few questions around what you have said, but I definitely can relate to a few of your points, especially around kind of the mentoring and the office. We're at a point, I think we're a little bit delayed in terms of working from home, but over the kind of last 6, 7, 8 months, we have been. A lot of organizations are starting to really understand that just having teams and the importance around being together, but also, the property piece as well around that you mentioned around space and how we're starting to use those and how we're going to return to work. So there are a couple of questions, and I'm sure people, if they please put them in the chat as well, if you have any. But I might just start with one that I have here, which is, so how have the major city centres retail offerings evolved, or potentially how are they looking to evolve or continue to evolve with fewer workers in offices and more in kind of suburban areas? How's that started to come into play over there?
That's a great question, and I think it's the honest answer to that is, in the city centres, it's had a pretty catastrophic effect. I know I'm based in the city on the days that I go into work, and I was actually down the street where my old office was last Wednesday, and 5 of the 6 catering outlets have closed down. That we're dealing with the local business population. We've started to see this being countered, and actually there were some initiatives brought forward by the UK government, which was Eat Out to Help Out. I don't know if you've heard anything about that one, but basically Eat Out to Help Out was a scheme where the government would match some spending in a restaurant when you went out to eat, and also took off the VAT and other bits and pieces of people. So it was all good news, trying to promote those kind of things. We have seen, however, it's been easier for a lot of the larger chains to actually furlough their staff and close their branches than it was for the small individual operators of a sandwich bar or what have you to actually take the hit. So unfortunately, there have been casualties through that. Is it back to normal yet? I think I was trying to book a couple of restaurants for breakfast the other day and I couldn't get one. So that's probably a little bit of the answer. But it has definitely affected the infrastructure in a negative way. And I'm hoping that the upswing and the bounce back will happen.
We're seeing that at the moment. I mean, with people at home, or the majority of people at home, the CBD is absolutely just dead. It's really sad to see. So we're obviously hoping that it does start to return and that vibrancy does come back. But it's interesting, to see how that is. And that's a great scheme, I think, for us as well. It's we need to start potentially thinking about how we can start to bring people back and bring life back to the city rather than just
it's just a lot of tumbleweed streets without it, I can tell you.
Another question, Steve, just that I had was around kind of current levels of occupancy now versus kind of pre-pandemic. What are you starting to see now around occupancy levels?
Occupancy levels the restrictions are off. A lot of organisations have actually called people back in and have reminded people that actually when you signed your contract, you did agree to this being your place of employment. It is an office and it is in the city. So we have seen that actually happen. So where organisations have given people flexibility, I think there's some age split differences in that. I know certainly the younger population have been quite keen to get back in. Because of the social aspects, not missing out on Thursday night drinks and that kind of stuff. For people with children and people in that kind of middle tier group of their life, I suppose, the balancing of being able to pick the kids up from school, do whatever, having a bit more flexibility around home working for a couple of the days a week have meant that there has been a drop in that. In my own organisation, we've actually given people a bit of the choice, apart from on the days when we call team meetings and team socials. So you work from wherever you think is best. And what it's meant for us is we've got about 50% occupancy in our space, but we've got flexi space anyway. So so we're not paying for empty desks, if you know what I mean. In terms of a lot of the larger employers, they are getting back pretty much towards full occupancy now on workplace numbers.
That's good to hear. Sorry, I've been hogging the questions, but is there anyone actually that just wants to unmute and actually ask Steve a question?
I can see one on here, Ash. I don't know if you want to go to...
I thought Lyndon's question was really good, actually. It's right here around, market confidence and, tenant moves. Are tenants staying put for the time being, reworking space, or you're seeing, tenants looking to shift, downsize? How's the UK in that regard? I thought it was a good question.
It's a very good question, and that's the one I could see that in the chat.
Sorry,
that's the one I thought we should take. So it is a really good question. Market confidence. Well, one of the things I think is as a precursor to that is that London was running out of space pre-pandemic, and the amount of space that was coming online had limited a whole bunch of moves, the ability to be flexible, and was a fair bit of a catch-up going on. However, there's not so many cranes on the horizon at the moment. So we've started to see the availability there had probably slowed quite a bit by what actually happened. And we had a number of contractors also affected during the whole pandemic thing about how many people they could safely get on site. Confidence-wise, yes, we have still seen people committing to new space, and that is great, because I think that we still do need to be pushing the envelope. We've also still got major new schemes like the regeneration of Brent Cross coming on, and it's being done by the same developer who developed King's Cross and took King's Cross from 32 acres of derelict marshalling yards and sort of redundant space, which wasn't a great place to hang around because of the sort of undercurrent that was there of drugs and everything else. And the whole thing completely cleaned up, made into a new destination and forming a new community. So to see Brent Cross still progressing along those with those bold development plans, I think does give a good indication of confidence that people are looking to push ahead with the future. The new space being created, not so much at the moment. New space being refurbished, or space being refurbished, interestingly, yes. What it has done for us is put a new spin on the A, B and C grade space conundrum that we have in London. So you've got these wonderful new, all singing, all dancing, state-of-the-art smart buildings on the upper end of the spectrum, commanding the best rental levels. If you bring that all the way down to the city of London, you've got red brick and stone buildings arranged around narrow streets with an existing infrastructure and community there, but not satisfying the green agenda and sustainability. So there's been a renewed drive to see what can be done with the B and C grade spaces in London to create spaces to allow people, in answer to Linda's question, to be more flexible and to maybe get the space that they need. We have seen a big upswing, and certainly January this year, we've really had quite an active market right the way across. All the contractors and design companies have been engaged, and a real take up again of, look, okay, we're coming towards the end of this now. Whether we are or not, I don't know, but we're coming towards the end of it. Let's get ready for the future. Let's not sit on our hands. We need to do something. So I think the long answer is yes. We certainly have seen confidence returning.
That's great, Steve. Thank you. I know there's one other one I think, which is pretty prevalent at the moment as well, around distribution and logistics. A question here from Sam. around kind of key steps taken to achieve, I guess logistics moving forward. And yeah, it's a huge challenge for us. And I don't know if there's anything over there that you can comment on that's we can take.
Yeah, I could certainly comment on it. A couple of the companies that have really been active have been Amazon.
Yes.
And one of the other logistics companies handling a lot of the deliveries for a multi-factor organization. So we've seen certainly the logistics centers being developed very rapidly. We've seen maybe a bit of a migration. I know actually I was chatting to a guy who delivered here the other day. One thing we did see was London cab drivers went from 300,000 registered London cabbies, and we're now at 160,000.
Wow.
But not because they've just hung up the keys for a while to the cab, they've left the industry. And the guy who delivered to me was a former black cabbie. So so people are moving sectors. So okay, the guy knew his way around, knows how to drive. So we've seen people migrating, I think, in terms of that kind of work context. Things that have affected it behind the scenes, however, have been the availability of trained and skilled staff. Amazon have gone on a major recruitment drive, to name them again, and certainly have been putting quite a lot of money into making sure that the infrastructure of their organization and their ability to train and develop people is there, and they have extra capacity. But we have seen we've got a major shortage, and this is not just COVID, but there is a result of us leaving the EU. Actually took out quite a lot of people who then decided to return home. Some of their decisions to return home to Europe were also driven by the fact of, do I really want to be stuck in a foreign country, namely the UK, living in isolation through a pandemic, or should I go and do that back home where I can do that with my family in Europe? And so we saw a huge loss. We've also seen the same thing in the construction sector, but it's left us with no HGV drivers. So there's a major initiative ongoing at the moment to train up a whole load of lorry drivers. So coming back to this point that Sam, you've just made in your question there, was about the staff shortages affecting things. Yes, we've had the same. We have had the same, but it's been where there's been the skill set gap and the migration, I suppose, across sectors to fill these new opportunities, new vacancies that are starting to come onto the market. But I can't see with much change at the moment in terms of distribution and logistics. People have started to get the habit. I think we all can now discern between online shopping and what you need to go to the shop for, whether you want to try something on or you're happy to get it delivered. But this pattern's here to stay. It really is here to stay.
No, thanks, Steve. There's some really interesting comments from yourself and understanding of what's been happening over in the UK, and it's summer. I think it's nice to hear, what's to come. I think we hopefully can, where we are now, we can think of the positives as well. I mean, there's some challenges that we'll overcome, but I think, as you said, the IT's progressed 10 years, which is a great benefit. I think the way in which we start to work, have that flexibility, between offices and home is obviously been a challenge, but I think there's also positives out of that as well, and other things. But we've got a little bit more time to go, I think, through this outbreak. But it's been great to hear from you and what's happened over in the UK, just slightly ahead of us. There's just a couple of points I think you mentioned, around kind of even just being an employer of choice now, thinking about, the HR, mental well-being, sustainability as well as a big topic that's coming out of this. And as you say, also the lease terms shifting and adapting to kind of suit occupiers is also a really interesting point. And the other piece as well that's I think everyone can relate to is, for more junior staff and the younger generation, is bringing in that mentoring and having that there and available as well, I think is really key. So the office isn't going, it's here to stay. It's been really, really good to hear, see your thoughts and what you've been through. So thank you so much. That takes us right on 9 o'clock. And thank you everybody for joining today or this morning. It's really great to have you join. And thanks again, Steve. It was really good.
Thank you, Ash, and thanks everyone. I hope you have a wonderful Friday.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.